We build everything here from Superbirds, original stuff, and then we got one section of our business up here just modifies new cars.
A ton of power.
There is a building in Level Cross, North Carolina, that most Americans have driven past without ever knowing what sits inside it. No sign points to it. No tour bus stops there. And for more than 60 years, the man who built it has let almost nobody through the door. His name is Richard Petty. You know him as the King. What you may not know is that somewhere behind the polished trophies and the museum displays that bear his name, there is a much older, much rawer collection that the public has almost never been allowed to see. Race cars stacked on top of each other, machines that never got restored, and pieces of a life spent at 200 miles an hour that Petty has simply never been ready to hand over. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. To understand why any of this matters, you first have to understand what Richard Petty actually did in a race car, because the scale of it is almost hard to believe. Between 1958 and 1992, Petty won 200 NASCAR Cup Series races. 200. No other driver in the history of the sport has come close. The next closest names on that all-time list sit more than 70 wins behind him. He won 7 Cup Series championships, a mark later tied but never beaten. He won the Daytona 507 times. In 1967 alone, he won 27 races in a single season, including 10 in a row, a streak that still stands as one of the most untouchable records in American motorsport. Across 34 years and more than 1,100 career starts, Petty built a resume so far beyond anyone else's that NASCAR essentially stopped treating his numbers as targets and started treating them as landmarks, the kind of thing nobody expects to see moved again. None of that happened by accident, and none of it happened alone. Petty Enterprises, the family racing operation, was founded in Level Cross in 1949 by Richard's father, Lee Petty, himself a 3-time champion and the winner of the very first Daytona 500 in 1959. Richard's brother, Maurice, built the engines that powered most of those 200 victories. Their cousin, Dale Inman, served as Richard's crew chief for the overwhelming majority of his career, calling the shots on pit road through championship after championship. For members of one family, from one small town, all eventually inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. That compound in Level Cross, the shop floor where the cars were built, tuned, and sent out to dominate stock car racing for 4 decades, is still standing today. And the private garage tucked into the back of it is the part of the story most fans have never gotten near. For a long time, Richard Petty didn't think much about preserving old race cars, because in the world he came up in nobody did. In the 1960s and 1970s, a used race car wasn't treated as history. It was treated as inventory. Teams needed cash to build the next one, so cars got sold off, stripped for parts, or simply left to rot behind the shop. Petty has said plainly in interviews over the years that he sold cars to smaller West Coast teams for whatever money he could get at the time, because nobody in that era imagined a beat-up stock car would someday be worth a fortune to collectors. Preservation wasn't part of the culture. It wasn't part of the business. So a real chunk of early Petty racing history simply disappeared, sold piece by piece into obscurity, and there's no getting it back. What didn't get sold, though, the cars that were too far gone to be worth anything to a buyer, or too tied up in other projects to move, ended up parked behind the shop in Level Cross. Petty himself has estimated that somewhere between 15 and 20 cars from his career sat there for decades, stacked in the open, exposed to North Carolina weather, never restored, never labeled, never turned into a display. It's an almost uncomfortable image once you think about it. Some of the most significant machines in American racing history, left outside like scrap because nobody at the time understood what they would eventually mean. Petty has talked about this with more honesty than you'd expect from a man of his stature. He knows what was lost. He's said so more than once, without much dressing it up. But the cars that did survive inside the actual garage, the ones kept under a roof, out of the weather, off the market, were kept for a different reason entirely. And that distinction is really the heart of this whole story. A car that's kept because it might sell well someday is a financial asset. A car that's kept because of what happened inside it on one specific afternoon, at one specific track, is something else, something the price tag was never really attached to in the first place. By every account from people who've actually stood inside that level cross garage, it's full of the second kind of car. Two vehicles in particular tend to come up whenever people who've been inside describe what they saw, and together they bookend Petty's entire career better than any highlight reel could. The first is a Plymouth Superbird. Built in 1970 specifically to exploit NASCAR's rules around aerodynamics, the Superbird was designed for one job: go faster than everything else on a superspeedway. Its pointed nose cone and towering rear wing weren't styling flourishes. They were Chrysler engineering decisions meant to cut drag and add downforce at speeds pushing 200 miles an hour. Petty drove Plymouth products to 18 wins during the 1970 season, and the wing car became permanently linked with his number 43 in a way almost no other model in his career quite matched. The Superbird that reportedly still sits in that level cross garage has never been restored for display. It's set to carry the actual marks of racing, scuffed bodywork, road grime, the wear of a machine that was built to be used hard, not polished for a stage. The second car is older, plainer, and in some ways heavier with meaning. It's a 1957 Oldsmobile, built by hand by Lee Petty and his sons right there in the family shop. And it's the car Richard Petty made his NASCAR debut in as a young man. It's rough by any modern standard, the kind of rust, and where that comes from being kept because of what it represents rather than what it's worth on paper. If the Superbird is the peak of what Petty became, that Oldsmobile is the moment right before any of it existed, a 20-year-old from a small North Carolina town pointing a car at a racetrack for the first time and finding out what he was made of. Neither car, by every indication, has ever been offered for sale. It's worth pausing here to separate what's actually open to the public from what isn't, because the two get confused all the time. The Petty family does run an official museum established by Richard's late wife, Linda, back in 1988, and it now sits back on the Level Cross compound after years in nearby Randleman. That museum is thorough, well-organized, and genuinely worth visiting if you care about NASCAR history. Championship cars, trophies, uniforms, and race-worn gear are all there for anyone who makes the trip. But the museum represents what Richard Petty has been willing to hand over to the public. The older, unrestored material tucked away in the working garage behind it represents what he hasn't, and by most accounts, has never felt any real pull to. When people ask Petty directly why he's kept so much of his personal history out of public view instead of sharing it with the fans who built his career, his answer tends to be some version of the same thing. Some things just aren't for crowds. They're for the people who were actually there. His son, Kyle Petty, raced professionally for more than 2 decades and has spent plenty of time in that garage himself, though he rarely talks about it publicly in any detail. For Kyle, by his own description over the years, that space was never really history, the way outsiders think of it. It was home, the same tools on the same walls he grew up watching his father and his uncle Maurice use, the same building where he later learned to work on engines with his own hands. Kyle's own career is worth pausing on too, because it's easy to reduce him to a footnote in his father's story when the truth is more complicated. Racing in Richard's shadow for his entire career, Kyle won 8 Cup Series races over roughly 18 years, a career that would be considered solid, even good, for almost anyone else in the sport, but one that was constantly measured against a father who'd won 200. Kyle has spoken candidly about what it meant to carry that name, and about how a place like the Level Cross Garage meant something completely different to him than it did to collectors circling from the outside. To them, it was potential inventory. To him, it was the room where he became who he was. Everything about that garage, and about how the Petty family talks about privacy and legacy in general, shifted after May of 2000. That's when Adam Petty, Kyle's son and Richard's grandson, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway. Adam was 19 years old, already racing professionally, and had just become the first fourth-generation driver in the history of any major American sport, having made his lone Cup Series start weeks earlier. His throttle stuck during practice, and his car hit the outside wall at close to full speed. He died of his injuries a short time later. The crash was devastating enough to the sport as a whole that it helped accelerate real safety changes across NASCAR in the years that followed, including improvements that likely saved other drivers' lives down the road. But for the Petty family, it was simply the worst day any of them had ever lived through. The first on-track death the family had faced in more than 50 years of racing together. Kyle and his wife, Patty, later founded Victory Junction, a camp for children with serious medical conditions, in Adam's memory, turning unbearable loss into something that has quietly helped thousands of families since. It's not hard to understand, once you know that, why a private space full of personal, unrestored history might mean even more to Richard Petty than it once did. The garage in Level Cross isn't just where old race cars happen to be stored. It's where 4 generations of one family's relationship with a sport that demanded absolutely everything from them has quietly lived for decades. Tools that belonged to Lee Petty still hanging where he left them. A car his sons built by hand. A wing car from the peak of the family's dominance. All of it existing in the same building, without needing to be explained to anyone outside the family. None of this happened because Petty Enterprises was flush with cash the whole way through, either. The team that dominated NASCAR for decades hit real financial trouble in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the sport grew more corporate and more expensive to compete in. Petty brought in outside investors and tried a handful of restructuring moves before the family eventually shifted its focus entirely toward Petty's Garage, a custom car building and restoration shop that has operated out of the Level Cross compound since 2008. Even during those genuinely difficult years, when a sale from the private collection could have provided real financial breathing room, nothing from that personal collection reportedly went to market. Whatever offers came in, and by various accounts, serious ones did, were turned down. Today, Richard Petty is in his late 80s and still shows up at Level Cross. He still wears the cowboy hat and dark sunglasses that became part of his visual identity across 4 decades of racing. And by consistent account from the people who actually meet him, he remains exactly what he appears to be: warm, present, and genuinely glad to talk with the fans who make the trip to find him. Petty's Garage continues doing serious restoration and custom work for customers who want the kind of craftsmanship the Petty name still represents, and members of the family, including Maurice Petty and Dale Inman, both now in their 80s, have continued to take part in projects that connect directly back to the cars they helped build 60 years ago. What the private side of that Level Cross garage really represents, more than dollar figures or rare parts, is a specific and pretty rare idea about what legacy actually means. Most of what gets called legacy in American sports lives entirely in public. Halls of Fame, record books, highlight reels, commemorative merchandise, all of it built to be consumed by people who were never actually there. Richard Petty built the most statistically dominant career in the history of his sport, and then he went home to a small town in North Carolina and quietly kept a piece of that history for the people who lived it alongside him. Not to inflate its value, not to create mystery for the cameras. Just because some of what it cost him to become the king was never something he felt belonged on a stage in the first place. And he's understood that clearly enough to act on it for the better part of 60 years. So the next time you drive past a plain-looking shop in a small North Carolina town, it might be worth remembering that history doesn't always live in museums with velvet ropes and gift shops. Sometimes it's parked quietly behind a family's garage, kept not because of what it's worth, but because of what it meant. And that might be the most honest kind of legacy there is. If this story gave you a new appreciation for what Richard Petty built, both on the track and in that quiet garage behind it, let us know in the comments. Hit subscribe for more untold stories from the world of American racing. And we'll see you in the next one.